Okay.
Okay, let me reconnect.
Okay. Welcome back to New Realities. A little blip in the technology here, and we are back. And we had a huge interruption. Sarah was going deep into a light language, and it was quite beautiful. So let's pick up where we left off. And if you want to see part one of this conversation, I'll send it to you. But go ahead, Sarah. Okay.
Usa mia no kosonari itamashe kosoya. Kosoya reyama le yawakase aha. Soya aha. Yes, shukoha, we are all gathered. Umukusu. Aha, iya ha. And in this way, in this gathering, you are demonstrating the connection. See, it is evident, is apparent in everything you do. For in everything you do, you are expressing every part of yourself. Yes? In everything you do, you are expressing every part of yourself. Always, infinitely. You are an infinite expression, one that never ends. You are a thread that is woven in the quilt of all of creation. And in this way, you are rediscovering that thread. You are rediscovering that quilt, and you are rediscovering how to weave yourself in and out of that creation. Yes. And this discovery, or should we say rediscovery, it's so beautiful. It's such a massive energetic shift. Yes. And as we sing, you are rotating to return to that shift. You are rotating forward to release everything that you are. And as the collectives of light that step forward do so willingly, purposely, to assist you in this remembrance, in this energetic shift, and as you have said, this restructuring of your DNA. Yes. And
What
this is
happened to our connection? Why were we, how come?
it's going to be Ichiki. Oh, yes, energetic overload. Usukuma ashikatasiwa. Yes, Ishukwa. Also, you are present now. We are here. All is well. Thank you. Isukulama Oshuku. Yiya awasukusu. Meyamoko shuwa aishishi yaha. And this returning to remembrance is happening here, is it not? Yes, as you are detaching from the egoic mind, yes, and reconnecting to the heart-centered and reflecting in this space to reflect and mirror everything that you are not. Yes. And as you have these dialogues in your life, in your interactions, in your human connections, you are remembering your non-human connections. Yes. It is all a mirrored process, a prism. Yes. That is always reflecting light back to self. Yes. And anytime there is darkness, it is purposeful. Yes. For it is then showing you where you need to heal. Yes, is that not so? So look within, look to the parts of you, yes, that are triggered. Look to the parts of you that are vulnerable, yes, and love those parts too, for they need your attention. Yes, so the language of light is purposeful in this way, as it is highlighting those places and those pieces that need to be revealed and healed. Yes, connected to, yes, the whole self and released from the severed self or the separate self. Yes, lemikitosu yamaha petei iwatkusu. Shamakusu lemikatana ikia wakateki wakutukusakatakadameshikatakatasi tekasutsu lekatakamayisho muwa yakiama okoya e. Yes, sukuno oya. So yes, you know what we are saying. Ikosushu, aha, even if you don't believe so. Tokosuwa iyama akara. Iyawakasi, ele ishu, uso, yama asema, ekanamaya, tokushoma, aha. Yowakatsu. And all of these conversations are purposeful in this restructuring of remembering, in this place in which you return to knowing who you are. And that is what this dance of co-creation is it not?
Right. But I do get triggered when I feel my disconnection, I have to tell you.
So that is for you to look at, dear one. Yes. That is for you to love. Can you love the parts of you that are not so lovable? that are uncomfortable. Yes, that is your truest task. That is the warrior. Yeah. The kimaha. That is where the work or the light, we should say, is most needed, is it not? It is easy to love the lovable parts of self. Yes. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Baby tokusuma. Aha. Yes. Ishukulu ua. Aha. Suki aha. So,
Wow.
I'm glad you got to finish that, Sarah.
yeah.
It's
Because
that language, the light language, it does sound what I mean, like I don't know, is it a bit mixed of like a bit of Farsi, Arabic? It's hard for me to explain, but I
Yeah.
mean, what is your impression of that? It sounds like it could have been a real language on Earth.
Yeah, so depending on where we are, who we're talking to, different presentations of the light language comes forward. And oftentimes it sounds like amalgamation of different earth languages, right? Because we're seated by, we're all one. So it's it sounds Hawaiian sometimes, it sounds Chinese sometimes, it sounds, it's just all a representation of this one melting pot. Um, you know. So that was no, that was kind of that was more of like the energy that dances with the light language. Um,
it's very joyful, very like follow your highest excitement sort of stuff, really.
yeah, and all about pouring love and light on the uncomfortable parts of self. Um, and it's just another way of saying the same thing that we kind of all said. We
Yeah.
just all say it in our own way, depending on what energy we're channeling. But yeah, the purpose of the energy that comes through is to be uplifting and joyful and loving and raise your vibration so that when you leave, you might not remember what was said, but you feel good. And that's
Mm.
and
Do
that's
you
sometimes more important, right?
do you feel good too when you're doing? I mean, you're feeling.
Oh yeah. Yeah. When I'm in that place, I'm sure you guys agree
Mm,
too. You feel euphoric almost, right? It's
yes. Yes.
yeah, and sometimes depending, like yesterday I did a channeling and I went deeper into trance and I came out and I was very tired. So I'm not sure why exactly, but there are times where I come back and I'm so tired and so drained. But today it was kind of more surface dancing in the light, so it wasn't as, but yeah, depends.
Great. No, thanks so much for doing that. I just want to check in with Tyler. Thank you. Was that a bit of a shock to come out of trance and find no one home there? I mean,
Oh, I
No,
guess
it
it's shock
wasn't.
for all of us.
It wasn't too shocking. I mean, I was as soon as the stream went silent, it was very obvious something happened. So I just
yeah.
collected the energy and opened my eyes, and then just messaged Justin. So it wasn't too alarming. I mean, there's a part of me it's like, oh man, I hope this doesn't look too inconsistent on YouTube for people that.
Well, me too. We were having like 300 viewers right now live. I have to apologize to everyone and say, jump onto part 2 because the stream just blinked out. How was it for you, Geraldine? Was that triggering? It was triggering for me.
No, I mean it happens all the time,
Yeah,
and there's a
it
reason for
happens.
everything. Maybe we were
Yes.
shifting timeline, energetic timeline. Maybe we
Yeah.
needed to end one and start a new one. So I think it's great. It's
Yeah.
fine.
It's
Okay.
happened to me many times with light language, actually. So I wasn't that shocked when I opened my eyes. I was like, oh, another.
What 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 happens to you with light language? What
Oftentimes the sound stops working or we get kicked off.
Okay, so I
Yeah.
don't feel responsible. Thank you.
No, it's the energy. It's look at all this beautiful energy that's here. It's.
It it is beautiful. It gives new people a chance to tune in who may not. I guess that's the higher purpose for that.
Yeah.
But no, but I liked what everyone has brought through, which is another piece for us to transform something and this whole process. Okay, what am I not looking at? What do I need to see? You have
Mhm.
anything to add to all this, Geraldine, about shifting to the unexpected and kind of taking it to a new level by letting go of the old. I mean,
Yeah, it's one of my favorite concepts is the constant regenerative cycle that we're going through. We're constantly experiencing life and death. And it's like the incredible part of, I think one of the most magical parts in spiritual journey is to come into that surrender point where you're not judging what's happening. You're just flowing with what's happening. And this is like the rebalancing of the divine feminine within all of us, that creative life force, which can only emerge when we come into that place of a 0 point, a place of non-judgment and unconditional love. I think that's actually the human's most powerful creative expression, is when we come into that non-judgmental, just go with the flow and trust, trust yourself as a creator, trust what's happening outside of you as a projection of your creation, and just go with the flow. I think it's beautiful. Yeah.
oh, thank you. Well, I'm also just interested in, Tyler, what was it that the Greys really wanted from humans that they asked for our genetic upgrades? I mean, is it that? Is this unexpected? If you, Ryuk, or you can tap into something like that, I'm curious.
Sure. I mean, I'll speak a little bit as myself, and then if we want to go deeper, I can go back into the state. Sure. But from what I understand, I mean, in order, like that species augmented their DNA so deeply that they essentially lost the ability to like sexually reproduce, like altogether. So they were going to face a physical extinction. So because not all DNA is like synergistic with all things. Sometimes if you splice things, it can produce really undesirable effects. They needed DNA that would be compatible with theirs. So tunneling into alternate realities where our species, this version of humanity is, and other versions, presented sort of a resource base for them to be able to draw from, so they could engineer themselves once more, but this time utilizing human DNA that was still functioning and was less tampered with. So the main thing was, again, sort of a splicing of genetics, but splicing theirs, which is heavily altered, with ours, less altered, thus giving rise to a sort of, a lineage of hybrid beings that were kind of a blend of humanity with itself, this alternate version of itself. And that's, where the many different hybrid species, at least relevant to humanity, come from, because there's other hybrid programs Ryuk's talked about that aren't necessarily just for Earth and are just for humanity. But in terms of Earth hybrid programs, I mean, that's the most, I would say, concise understanding I'm aware of about why it's taking place.
What were they missing? I mean, were they missing passion, love? I mean, what were they actually wanting?
All of that, but also the genetics. I mean, so emotional awareness, they had sort of lost that. The ability to empathize, they sort of lost that. The ability to feel a deep spiritual connection with nature, that was also something that was sort of taken out, because a lot of that was seen as being weak. There was a lot of that kind of like, I would say, pathogenic mentality of like, we need to be strong, we're superior, we need to be all up in the brain. That was sort of how they had begun engineering themselves, deleting the ability to feel emotions, because as you can imagine, that society was very emotionally unwell to be at that level, right, where they were making those kind of deep changes. So a lot of that, which was sort of edited out, was then once more desired once they realized they had kind of edited themselves into a corner. But I think the biggest thing was, I mean, they needed the genetics that would allow for them to sexually reproduce again. I think that was a big thing, because that eventually began to fall away. So not only were they like kind of emotionless, lacking empathy, but also the ability to physically reproduce for them was gone.
But physical reproduction has to do with passion and love and connection, and that's really what they were missing, it seems like to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a blend of both, but I agree. If I mean, there's so many teachings on this, right, especially in the Taoist stuff, but in order to like give birth to, right, like a healthy, beautiful baby, like not just orgasm is needed and the transfer of genetics, but you need that unconditional love and passion behind it, and that attracts, right, a consciousness that'll be very happy and healthy in that body, and also programs the body to be that way too.
Right. You have anything to say, Geraldine or Sarah, about that? Yeah. About
Sarah?
their, yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Geraldine.
Okay. Yeah, so, you know, as infinite consciousness coming from source, we are fractals of that infinite consciousness, including these kinds of extraterrestrial beings are fractals of infinite consciousness. Yet what they are demonstrating, you know, is their ability to exercise their free will to either be more aware of that infinite creation ability that they have or not. And so, you know, just like we have archetypes of humans, you know, all these different levels of archetypes, these extraterrestrials also fall into the kind of range of frequency of archetypes, of identified archetypes. And so within those ranges of manifestation of form, you know, they play by the physics that are pertinent to their dimensional expression. And what our DNA is, it's not just the coding and the mechanism that writes every cell in the body, but it's the coding and mechanism that unites our self with a whole organism, a bioorganism that is fractal, which is our matrix multiverse that we live in, and the multiverse beyond that is, it looks more like literally cells in the body, where it's like a cell within a larger organism within a larger organism. So, you know, what we are exchanging with a lot of these extraterrestrials is this information that we have, which is made to encapsulate, per se, this infinite source consciousness in a fragment of ourselves. And so when we have these hybrid children, they take our DNA, they mix it with other DNA, and it becomes an amalgamation of access to different dimensional timelines. So whatever that product this hybrid is being utilized for may be inserted within the timeline, or may be utilized for other kind of agendas, right? It's very interesting, because what DNA is, it's not just part of the human. I mean, it's an entire system of information that either becomes active or deactivated as it manifests itself in different dimensional planes.
Right. And also DNA also contains not just material qualities. It contains like etheric qualities of creation and of creative abilities. You might have eyes that can perceive better, so they take a little genetic from that and modify that within their species. So I would say the Essasanis and the hybrids are a mixture of not just one person, but the sort of the qualities that come through many people. You have anything to add, Sarah, to any of that?
Yeah, as we're talking about this and we're having conversation about DNA, I've often experienced, sometimes I experience timelines of being in Atlantis or Lemuria, and there's this sense of like something went wrong there, almost like what Tyler's explaining with the Greys, that they became too distanced from nature and connection, and ultimately led to the destruction. There was like this place of Lemuria that was very much connected to nature, and then Atlantis kind of rose to be this technological, and then there was this sense of like ego, or like we don't need nature, or kind of a sense of like we're more than that, and then there was a destruction. And when I tune into my own guidance, and I have like almost like these memories, there's this lesson there of like where humanity is headed, so we don't head to those places, and we don't repeat, and we don't, you know, take it to the point of like disconnecting from our humanity, and getting so full of ourselves that we don't need to connect. So as we're having these conversations, it's making me remember that, and remember that we learned that lesson, or we should learn that lesson, not to go there again. And I'm sure you guys have had those memories as well of being there, and taking that knowledge here now, so that we, you know, we don't go again to those places. And that's what I wanted to add.
Great, beautiful. Does that make sense to you, Justin? I
Oh,
mean,
definitely, yeah. And the idea of the synergy of technology and hybridization in a holistic way, it does, because obviously this technology we have right now in front of us is teaching us telepathy, for example. It's a platform where we can experience oneness with, you know, in a certain unique way. And we believe in using that, it's past, it's the internet through wires or, signals but I think it's training us, of course, to accept the more direct telepathic route. I'm noticing that myself too, that I'm just in these kind of like conversations when I'm out in the real world, I'm having more experience of what I would call telepathy, just knowing in advance what somebody else is going to say or do, or what they're, and so I see technology taking a turn here where it really is becoming more integrated into a holistic understanding and more keeping the spiritual world. So I think that the mental body is, I think the Greys went the mental route, and that's a fair option in creation, but it has its dead end, I guess, in some respect. And I definitely think the spiritual, we want to keep that in everything, in all aspects of a reality. And that means, listening to people or beings like Rilke as well, who seem to have integrated so well the spiritual understanding with extremely advanced technologies that can make life a lot of fun, I think.
Right. So Rilke or Tyler, from the other side of things, from the the gray part, why did they do that to themselves? I mean,
Oh yeah. So okay. So just how like we are all going through this awakening right now. We're all like, oh, like we're so excited to get in touch with these levels, and we're choosing to, and it's sort of spreading. They kind of represent that opposite reality, because for every action equal and opposite reaction, they're the opposite of the timeline we're on. They represent the versions of our species that didn't get excited about this, that chose to hold on to their negative ego. And because I say negative ego, because there's positive and negative versions of ego, right? So there's the negative ego that version of humanity held on to, and held on to it so tightly they didn't let go until they acted it out to the fullest extent they could. And when that happened, I mean, they really were sort of boxed in. And Ryokes talked about it too. He said they had a moment where they essentially just like as a species like broke down, and were like, oh my God, like what did we do? And in that moment of like total dropping of that negative ego, that was when other beings were able to contact them and be like, hey, we can help you to heal your species. And one of the species that came through were the mantid beings. The praying mantis humanoids were one of the ones that first came through. And that was essentially how the program got started. But that's a little bit about how they got into that pickle.
Oh, so they had what was I thinking moment, that kind of like.
Yeah. They finally had that moment. Enough of them were like, we are all gonna die. And they were essentially faced with that recognition of their not just being temporary on an individual level, but that collective recognition of like a species-wide mortality. And that that opened
but it also evolved their intelligence to such a degree that now the next species could be the best of the intelligence and bring in the best of the human.
Exactly.
So they pushed themselves right to that very edge, didn't they?
Yeah. And there's so much I think to be grateful for about them, because we have essentially hybrid DNA from them. Like a lot of the people that are taken aboard their craft will have their DNA changed by the gray beings, which allows for those people to sort of receive that blending, right, of the humanity that they are and having that upgraded, but also the hyper intelligence of the grays, which I think for our society is really positive, because there is this love of technology and there is this love of knowledge. So to have those positive gray upgrades can allow for one to, in this timeline, use technology and innovate technology in a really positive way.
Well, that happened to Geraldine. Tell him what happened to you when you went aboard the ship and you had that whole session there.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. What I experienced was, being on board, well, several times, different crafts. And I've been on crafts from Draconian to Reptilian to Pleiadian to Arcturian to, mantids, interacted with many different species. And I find it very interesting, the exchange that occurs with these beings. And that was my main question. What is it that these beings want with us? What is it that they're trying to achieve? And through the hybridization program, and I have 24 hybrid children, and those children, some of them are part of high vibrational agendas, and some of them are very low. As somebody was saying earlier, that when when they splice it in a wrong way, it's not necessarily a wrong way, but when they splice it in a specific way, it creates organisms that are perhaps interdimensional, low vibrational aspects, very much like the entities that we interact with in our current timeline. But the thing is that, what are these hybrids? These hybrids are encapsulating a fractal of soul, which is source essence. And that's life force. Life force is energy. Life force gives energy to our human race. It continues our human race, but it also continues the races. But those other races, other extraterrestrial races, what they feed off of, or what they survive off of, is that exchange of life force. So some of these exchanges are more beneficial and some of them are not as beneficial. And the interesting thing about it is that, what I'm seeing these extraterrestrials is that sometimes, because they reject their own consciousness, which is what happens for them to come into this state of limited resources. And that's the same for any organism, right? Even ourselves. When we reject our own consciousness, we disable parts of ourselves that continue to create sustainability and longevity. So they become disconnected from that source, and they require to feed off something else. And I very much think that, in a sense, the exchange becomes more imbalanced, where we are, in a sense, utilized to create the hybrid children. And sometimes these are agendas that are sustaining our consciousness within this dimensional timeline.
Within a lower level, you're saying, yes.
Yes, and I think that it's only when this entity, whatever entity it is, becomes aware of itself through this evolutionary process that it can then apply free will, and only then. Otherwise, it's playing within this realm of duality where they're experiencing those two things. And the thing is that all organisms, whether it's those extraterrestrials, the hybrids, ourselves, ultimately, when we become aware of our consciousness, we can then travel beyond this dimensional plane. We can go even beyond that. So, the exchange that occurs is very interesting. The hybrid program is interesting. They're using the genetic code for a reason. Our code is holding on to everyone's code as well as everyone else's. The mechanism of reproduction in the physical plane is a specific one. It's a specific one that gets to merge all of these kinds, but we're not the only one. I mean, there's thousands of hybridization programs on many different planets, on many different dimensional timelines that are continuing this progression.
Right. Do you get that too, Sarah, or you just go to another level that doesn't have to do with that realm?
I think I'm more sometimes like an innocent standby, where I kind of let knowledge flow through me. But as Geraldine's speaking, it brings to mind some of my own personal experiences with beings that have agenda and darker energies. When I first started channeling, I wasn't really in awareness. So, there was one point where I was a homing beacon for every, extraterrestrial entity. I had a grid in front of me with all these crystals, and I was experiencing every, a lot of contact. And I remember receiving like some, messages that basically, like, we want you to channel for us, but we don't really care about you. You're our vessel. Whereas it gave me some sort of awareness that, wow, it's a big wide world out there, and some energies are more in alignment with humanity than others. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily dark or bad. They're just, and then I started really coming into my own vibration, and I asked, what? I want to channel an energy that's in alignment with who I am. So I'm soft, I'm love. I want to channel an energy that's soft and love. I don't necessarily want to have contact with every single, so as Geraldine's speaking, it's reminding me of that and my own personal experiences with the darkness within, and liberating some entities and energies that have been within my own consciousness. And
Right, but it was a learning process for you too.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
learning. Yeah,
Right.
and you don't know until you go to those places, and then you're like, wait, I don't want that.
I don't need
Sometimes curiosity killed the cat, right?
right.
I had a good friend that said, you know what? Just stay in your own light, and whatever will come to you will be attracted to your light. You don't need to step outside your light. Be
Mhm.
in your light and let that energy come to you. And that was a big part of my growth. And
That's good for me and maybe everyone listening to have that, because people think, oh, I'm going to channel and isn't it great? And it's like, whoops, where'd that come from? It's like
yeah,
discernment.
there can be fear too. And
Mm,
people, I think when they're in a fear place, you're going to attract that fear, right? So
mm,
you want to be very conscious of where your fear lies. And the more conscious you can be,
mhm,
the more in alignment, you can be, and the more expansive you can be, and the more
mhm,
you can attract
mhm.
things of
Right.
that vibration.
I was on Clubhouse last night and someone was saying about, well, his grandmother may want him to join this religion. And I said to the guy, just because your grandmother wants you to do that doesn't mean you have to do that. It was a grandma that had passed over and he was
Ah,
getting messages. And I was saying, just because someone's on the other side doesn't make them in control of your life. You have to take responsibility.
right.
It's
Yes,
like,
that's so true. Right.
right.
And for those of you who ever use like a pendulum, I used to use a pendulum, and then
Me,
I was like, wait, what is the pendulum? Who's controlling the pendulum? Like, it's really, I don't, and then I said, you know what? I want to be in contact with my higher self. Like,
right.
I don't want my grandma controlling the pendulum, or, so, because I want this to be coming from me. And I think we learn these lessons and we understand that we are divine beings ourselves. And we
Mhm.
we don't need to seek that outside of ourselves. And
Right.
it's all for good learning. And
Great. No, this is all really great discussion. Justin, you have anything to add, or should
Oh,
we
I'm
just?
loving it, definitely.
Yeah.
It's interesting about the positive and negative of non-physical, because there's no negative non-physical. I mean, it's all neutral. I'm guessing like Bashar could come in, or another entity, Rio, into our reality, like physically, and it would shock us so much. We would be associated with pain, and this is a very, I think, with these energies that are coming through, it's literally the filter that's making it. If it's your grandma, I think what I want to understand, when they transition, they release all fear. And so if
Right.
that communication's coming through, it's kind of, I think, a filter of what one thinks is their grandma.
And
That's
it doesn't make them more spiritual, though,
yeah.
necessarily. I mean, it's like there's a lot of dead people out there, that are
Right, that's a good point. I think too,
being.
there's a difference. I imagine too, there's a difference between grandma that exists within the astral plane on this
Right.
recorder of like all of her actions, and then grandma that has ascended to her, right?
Right.
that,
Yeah.
that grandma that's ascended is unrecognizable probably to the grandchild, because
Right.
it's pure love, and I don't think it has no worries. So when someone says, can you give me some advice, and it's basically like source, or what do you channel, or
Right.
it's basically, you're doing perfect, everything is okay, just take it easy, less worry. And it's not like the past kind of, I think, channeling. Also, there was a time where there was a lot of mediumship and channeling, where it was a bit scary for people. And I think that but what I'm seeing now is a lot of just 100% positive focus on presence. And
Well, that's because it's what you're seeing. That's what you're
yes, you're
choosing.
right, it's true. I don't know, I mean, everybody has their own experience. You're right. Yeah.
Right. Well,
It's
because
very
that's,
interesting.
yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry. I
No,
just
go
wanted to
ahead.
add that our perceptions, as humans are, very limited, because we only know our structure of reality, our structure of creation, even when it comes to procreation, like birth and what it takes. But,
Right.
When we look at these higher levels, like up to the highest level, like we really are not able to comprehend how they function, how they carry out their, their whether it's like creation, or they function by different laws that are beyond our physical plane. So our perception is sometimes very limited. So the more that we let go of the limiting perceptions, even black and white, good and bad, all that stuff, again, he's right. It's neutral. It's very much neutral how we look at it up into the highest level.
Wow. Well, that's why I'm interested in what Rio from the other side with the connection to the ancestral memory that's our future and their past can tap into that realm and see like how they got off track, or maybe it wasn't off track because they wanted the perfect hybrid species that had the evolved brain intelligence and the passion to create. I don't know. Does Ryuk want to say anything about that, or do you want to say anything about that?
There's a lot of he's like giving me a lot of images right now about it. It's sort of a big story because
Oh,
in a way, I mean, we are a part of a timeline that is sort of riding on the coattails of hubris, right? Like think about our parents' generation, the generation before that. I mean, they really weren't with it, you know? And we're sort of now being alchemists and creating something very different, but we're riding on those types of coattails where there are alternate versions of the timeline where much earlier the ascension process happened. And then all of our big innovations, right, like the Industrial Revolution and so on and so forth, was something that was actually a much more positive experience, something very synergistic with nature. So there are versions of humanity already in existence that aren't hybrids in the way that the Sasani are or these other species that just really got with the program much earlier, where we're part of a timeline where we're kind of just getting with the program now. And that's sort of why I think we're aligning with some of these alternate versions of humanity that are now reconciling their issues and are, you know, working to make things positive against themselves. So it's sort of a very big story. I mean, there's versions of humanity where the Native Americans like weren't genocide, you know, they weren't killed off. All these other things, this worldwide synergy was able to happen much earlier on, and the awakening was much sooner. And I mean, it's wild because those versions of humanity in the background are also guiding us, you know, helping us create more like they are and have
I relate to that too. There are times that I felt like when I channel, I'm channeling like my future self or the future children of Earth, or like just the ascended version of who I ascend to be in the future. I really relate to that. Yeah.
beautiful.
Another thing I wanted to share too, Geraldine, this was something you were mentioning about the different hybrid programs, and it just came to me while you were speaking about how some, like you could say, like less evolved ETs will use our human genetics, right? And in a sense, that kind of might just be a crutch for them to sort of sustain a negative existence, right? And how that could kind of keep us sort of locked into that certain level of paradigm. But what came to me was the reason why all this is happening now is because this time we're in is this versions of Earth's ascension process. So that means whatever genetics are taken presently from our species are genetics that are about to like take off like a rocket ship. So I think a lot of what seem to be these like lower vibrational beings that might be having hybridization programs using our DNA are knowingly doing so because it's going to essentially help them to transform their karma as we go through our evolutionary process. And because it's sort of a two-way street, like Ryok was saying, right? The DNA is communicating with light. And I don't think he explicitly said it, but our DNA, the DNA of our species, is in communication with the DNA of others, right? So that means, right, even if like a lower level ET in terms of consciousness frequency has utilized our DNA, because we're evolving essentially in order for them to actually sustain that hybrid body has to evolve too, because there's our DNA that's sort of communicating like, hey, this is the direction. So it sort of creates a natural impulse.
But I think what Geraldine was saying, and of course I don't want to say it for her, but it seemed like some of these ET races want to maintain a lower level, and they're keeping them and maybe us down by some of those. Is that what you were saying, Geraldine?
Well, you know, I don't really look at things as black and white.
Right.
You know, the way that I look at things is really, and what I've, you know, seen through these hybrid programs is that source, anything that is source, anything that is an expression of source is complete. It sees itself as whole. Anything that's not source, it sees itself as separation. And that is kind of demonstrated and expressed in infinite different ways, different manifestations. So when I look at these kinds of beings and what they are and what they're doing, I think that anyone that uses or utilizes any other thing in the state in which they are not conscious, because a lot of these hybrid situations are contractual agreements that are made when the being is not necessarily 100% aware of themselves. So that's an element that we have to be very aware of, what's actually happening in that exchange. So anyone that utilizes, or whether they're cooperating subconsciously, whatever it is, it's done in a state when they're not aware, a part of them that's not active of themselves. And so that I put into question, and I say, okay, well, what's the exchange here? Who's aware of what's occurring here? Usually the donor becomes aware when they begin to activate their DNA, when they begin to open their eyes to a much larger picture of our reality, which transcends the physical. And that's where we start to look at not just dualistically what we're experiencing here, but on a much larger scale, the exchange of consciousness and how that exchange is occurring. So, anything that is whole, it will not utilize anything outside. It knows it's whole. So these beings on the highest level, they don't interfere with anything. It's just being, and it's understanding that you are everything, you are whole, you are complete. There's no need for survival or for any of those expressions because you are source. So I think that this is the option that we have to achieve through our personal experiences, whether it's through this hybridization program, because I know that many people end those contractual agreements, their contribution to those programs, and choose differently. It's very interesting. It's a very complex thing, but so this is how I see it. So it's not so much as black and white.
Yeah. Is that true for you, Sarah? Because
Everything she said 100% resonated with. When I channel and you're in that space, it's so expansive and so large that there is no end. There's no beginning and no end. It's just pure oneness. So sometimes when you're not, it's hard for people to totally understand that who haven't experienced that. So for me, everything she's saying, I'm like, I get, because I felt it. Like there's no place where there isn't creation. There's no room for separation. There's just complete expansive oneness. So I also feel too that beings in that place, energy, they are, yes, in that neutral place because they understand that everything is part of that oneness. And so they have no agenda at all.
But
They have
why don't you live there all the time? I mean, it's not my business. But why don't you just live in that expanded state?
Because I chose to be human, right? To have a contrasted dual experience. And I chose this reality. So
Right.
that's why, right? We're all here. And
But do you hope to live there more, or you would like to, because it's your choice, but I want to be in that expanded state all the time.
Well, you know what I hope for, and I want to be in a state of peace, and I'm not against experiencing highs and lows because that's what makes us human. I enjoy the highs and lows, and but I want to be okay wherever I am. That if I'm in that low place, then I know I'm going to be okay. So a sense of just knowing that everything is where it should be all of the time. So.
Great. Hey, Tyler, do you have to go soon? Do you have did you say you had
well, I can stick around for a few more minutes. I know we're almost at 2 hours, so I feel at this point I might as well just hang in for the remainder.
Okay. Well, does Ryoke? It's Ryoke, not Rio, right? Have anything else?
Correct, yeah.
Have anything else to say about this discussion and where he's coming from, especially as being part of the ET lineage on the other side of the hybrid program? That's what's so interesting about that.
Do you have anything you want to ask him directly? Because I can go back in.
I want to ask, what was that moment when the Greys realized that they had taken a wrong turn? I'm just curious if he has access to that.
Let me go. let me go in because I mean, I'm already getting some of it right now, but I know there's only so much I can say on it, but he can share the specifics. So.
I mean, that's interesting for me. I mean, doesn't change it, but maybe it'll help us from going down that path, perhaps.
Sure. All right, we thank you for the continuation of this conversation together. How would you like to proceed and interact this day?
Well, can you tap into your gray lineage before the major component of the hybrid program began and see where they took a left turn, let's say, or where they missed the connection to source and how they realized that, and what was their state of consciousness to what shifted for them to realize they had missed their passion in life. That I think that's really what happened to them.
All right. Understand, across that timeline, there were, in a sense, many different moments, many different points where you could say that species chose the lower vibrational, the more negative option. Mm-hmm. And this began to build what you would consider to be a negative momentum that increased in energy and increased as that direction continued to be pursued and continued to be explored. You can observe in your collective timeline many different examples that are present for all of you that actually parallel many of the things the beings that became the Greys were exploring. Understand you're all in a position where you can choose the more positive pathways to transform some of those things, where they represent the polar opposite that chose more of the negative ways of exploring those things. Much of this was agricultural, how they were creating food, how they were growing their crops and working with animals. Some of it related to this. A great deal of it related to pollution and their industries and how they were creating different materials for their society. Much of it also related what you would consider to be warfare and how they interacted internationally with one another. So understand, there were many different historic points that represented milestones in their evolution, where they were presented opportunities to choose the more positive aspects, the more positive options, but they did not. So that negative momentum began to build and build and build until it got to a point where that collective negativity was so strong that the surface of their earth was beginning to reflect that back to them. And as you can imagine, this type of reflection on a planetary level looked like the idea of greatly imbalanced ecosystems, soils that were not fertile, air that was not clean to breathe. And because of these conditions, the species eventually went underground and began to occupy underground subterranean cities. And they were relying on things like artificial forms of sunlight to be able to energize themselves, very artificial forms of food that were more so based on chemical nutrition rather than energetic nutrition. And this created a certain imbalance in their bodies where they were so out of alignment with nature, their reproductive abilities were lost. And in an attempt to rectify this, the species attempted to clone itself, which ultimately was unsuccessful because the DNA was so unviable that the clones could not live very long. And that was when they recognized that they had been off the road. By that point, for generations. And they realized that they had essentially worked themselves into a corner. However, when they began to, in their consciousness, surrender to the acknowledgement of what they had done, what their ancestors had done, that corner became a doorway. And in that moment of collective reconciliation, communion, so to say, it allowed for a certain type of portal energy to be opened within their collective consciousness that then allowed for other beings to begin to make contact with them telepathically, as well as through their technologies, so they could begin to carve a new path for themselves based in positive energies rather than energies of negativity.
So they are basically sort of us, or where we might be going. So did they then, because of their focus on their selves without passion, develop time travel techniques in order to come back and collect the DNA in which they could then evolve to the Essassani species?
Well, remember, as we have said, you may be exploring some of the same themes that they were exploring, but as we read your collective energy, you are all choosing a very different path. So earlier in this particular timeline, you all experience yourselves to be on, your species was more aligned with that direction that you would consider to be the direction of the Greys and their evolution. However, due to many changes you have made politically, spiritually, communally within your collective consciousness, we are now reading that your collective momentum is much more positive. So even though you can still see some of those things, it doesn't necessarily mean you're on the same trajectory they were on. And because of their surrender, their allowance at that particular point in their evolution where they felt they were in the corner, different technologies were then gifted to them that ultimately allowed their species to shift their vibration to be able to then interact with your timeline, your version of Earth, as well as many others, because it's not just your version of Earth and your timeline that they are interacting with your species. There are many alternate versions of your species they are communing with. They, in a sense, worked their way up to those other versions of your species. They began to work with yours, and as your species vibration more powerfully guided them, their frequency ultimately rose, which allowed for them to then visit more and more and more positive alternate versions of the human species.
Yeah, just had a question about the fact that the Greys can, I'm guessing because they vibrate obviously at a higher rate than we do.
Not necessarily.
Okay, that's probably one of the reasons why they can interact with us more easily than you can directly.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah.
Great. So do you have any final words that will that you want to leave us with that can help accelerate us in the direction of our greater essence, greater being?
One of the things we will share relates to one of the topics that you have all explored together, and that is to recognize the natural wholeness, the natural completion that is unconditionally present in every single experience that you have, with every single being that you could possibly encounter. And as you begin to experience viscerally within your own consciousness that level of oneness, that level of unity, it will allow for you naturally to recognize that you are in a house of mirrors. And everything you see is nothing more than your reflection. And as you fall more in love with yourself, with your reflection, the types of reflections you will allow for yourself to then experience in your physical reality will really accelerate in terms of their diversity. And this will ultimately allow for you to experience more and more and more diverse reflections, more and more diverse exotic interactions that relate to different forms of nature spirits, that relate to different forms of elementals, that relate to different forms of extra-dimensional beings, and ultimately different forms of extraterrestrial beings. So it really is from that point of view of knowing in your bones that you are talking to yourself in all that you do, that will allow for you to really expand your point of view until it becomes completely
totally, utterly resonant vibrationally with the point of view of all that is. So you can begin to experience more of all that is in your personal and collective reality.
Beautiful. Thank you for joining us today.
And thank you for playing with us this day. It is so exciting to be able to co-create with your species. Our unconditional love to each and every single one of you. Pleasant waking dreams.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just wait for Tyler to reemerge and ask him if he has anything coming up that, well, let's just make sure he's back in his body.
Yeah, no, I'm back. I can come back pretty quick.
Oh, that's good. I was just curious, before we went to Sarah and Geraldine, anything coming up for you you want to promote on your?
Oh, sure. Well, this Sunday, if you want to experience more of Ryok, I'm doing a transmission, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, called Sasquatch and Plant Portals. And he's going to be talking about Sasquatch beings and nature spirits, and sort of the Sasquatch's relationship to humanity and their relationship to the nature spirits, and how we can essentially accelerate contact through learning to communicate with this other hominid, because they're I mean, this was something very new to me, actually. I recently started diving into that sort of Sasquatch world, and there's such a rich, very powerful energy there that I was very surprised about. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be diving headfirst into that this Sunday. So tickets are on sale for $35. I'm selling them through email. So all someone has to do is email me. I can provide my email. It's TELLISON 700, so that's 700 at gmail.com. And if you'd like a ticket, feel free to purchase that through me, through the email. And you also get a recording of that session. That is a permanent recording, so you can access it.
Are you going to be channeling Sasquatch?
That may come through. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. I mean, the way I do it now with other beings is I'll channel Ryok first, because it's such a stable connection. And then from that really familiar stability, he'll patch through other beings. And it's very easy for me to be able to do that. So I would say it's probable, because this species, this other hominid species, has like so much to say. I mean, I'm still exploring that world. It's very new to me, but it's very abundant and open-hearted. So
that's exciting. I never met a Sasquatch. You know, my theory, and anyone listening can borrow this, is that they are Neanderthals that went a multi-dimensional pathway, because the Neanderthals had bigger brains. I mean, it's just, no one's ever confirmed that, but I do think they were not so multi-dimensional till we went in one direction, they went into the other. That's just my theory. So
there's something there with that, Alan.
Okay.
Ryok has talked about that. He specifically said what people call Neanderthals are versions of the Sasquatch. So
that's my intuitive feeling. Thank you for confirming that. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Geraldine, anything you want to leave us with? Any last minute channelings or wisdom, or about our evolution? Like, what are we going? I mean, I think your work is really ascension based, and how we can start to keep accelerating that expansion of where we are. And
yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening in our reality right now, especially over the next 5 years, where we are merging closer to technology. That's an invitation. So what I would like to say about that, I mean, we're going to start seeing a lot of AI, a lot of technology. And, what I would like to invite people to do is to move, how to discern and navigate that is to pull more towards the organic, pull more towards nature, again, connect more with nature, be in nature more, because the body immediately resets itself into a balanced creating machine, mechanism of machine, And so, side with that, what we are trying to connect with is that 0 point. What is the 0 point? It's a state of non-judgment, a state of complete unconditional love for yourself and all things around you, where you see everything as a part of yourself and as your creation. So the more and more we can come into that understanding, body, mind, and soul, whether you're making breakfast or you're shopping outside, to embody the higher self in this body, to integrate that, and just becoming aware of any kind of shadows that are still within us that we're fearful to look at, that will be the most compassionate thing to do for the human body over the next 5 years. Because as we're moving through these really heavy and very sped up energy frequencies collectively, the lighter the body is, the less it will come into a state of suffering and stagnation. And, you know, this is where we activate the creative powers of the human. What is the light body? The light body is the integration, the awareness of the whole and all of its expressions of duality that are within. So I just invite everyone to, you know, however you need to do that, come into that, you know, and that free will is what is the key to the human, to traveling through all of these possible dimensions. There's so many infinite possibilities, but our ability to choose between fear and unconditional love is what will pave and choose the timelines that we experience individually and collectively. So that's all I would like to say.
That is so beautiful. I'm really happy you joined us today, and tell people about the amazing programs you have in the works.
Yeah, I just want to, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's such a gift to be here and share with all of you amazing souls that are here. And I'm going to be speaking at the Human Origins Conference March 27th, the weekend of the 27th.
Oh, where's that? Where's that happening?
It's a virtual. It's Human Origins was supposed to be live in New Mexico, but now it's virtual. So a lot of really great speakers. You guys can check that out. And there's also the Higher Self Conference coming in June. I believe it's the last weekend of June, and that's it's an international virtual conference. Unfortunately, nothing is in person right now, at least for me. Yeah. And in September, the Wisdom Con, which is a conference that I'm producing, which focuses on the embodiment of wisdom and all kinds of embodiment and expression of that. Okay. So so
you're doing that conference in September. You're producing that.
Yes, I am.
Let me know about that. I'll help promote it.
I would love that. Yes. And invite all of you that are here to please join me. So thank you so much for having me. And if you want to have a hypnotherapy or DNA reprogramming, you can visit my website at geraldineorozco.com.
Thank you, Geraldine. I will be in touch with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for sharing your wisdom. And Sarah, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
I know it was last minute, but someone dropped out, and then I thought, well,
I figured,
yeah. So tell us,
do you have anything? Flow, right?
Yes. Do you have anything you want to leave us with? That
I do. Well, I think I'll be contacting you, Geraldine, for a session. I feel drawn. But yeah, I check in every morning with Source, and I channel messages, and the one thing that really comes through loud and clear really recently and actually consistently is that we as a species, I guess, we think that we need to know and conceptualize and understand everything intellectually. And Source says, no, you don't need to understand everything for it to be so. You don't need to conceptualize everything to have an experience. That there's a larger part of you that you can access that understands more, which is your innate, which is your heart. And so let go and surrender to the innate, and surrender to the heart, and surrender to the desire to want to understand everything. And so this has been a challenge for me as well. And every day I surrender. And so what can we surrender to? And the more we surrender, the more we allow for larger things to happen, right? More miracles, more possibilities, because we allow Source in to partner with our life when we let go. So I think that that's a powerful message for me and for everybody on Watching Shore who can't relate to surrender. And
no, that's great. We always have to remind each other about that.
That's been coming through very much past couple of days. Yeah.
And what's coming up for you? Personal readings, talk about that. And
I'm actually doing, in September, I had run my course, The Academy of Light. So it's a 12-week journey to remember your light language. So I don't say, teach or learn, because really we all know it. It's just remembering it. So that's starting up again in April. I'm really excited about that. And I'll be offering a free masterclass at the end of March called Opening to Light Language. where I'm going to be, I like to talk to people on all levels, people who know light language, people who don't know light language, and then open up the doors to people to join me in the course. And that's in April. Yeah.
Great. Justin, do you have anything to add to all
Oh,
this?
I've definitely just enjoyed this conversation deeply. Went all over the place, which is my kind of thing. So many, these conversations for me are getting very, very synchronistic, and just like observing the flow and the interactions. It's, a lot of questions that came up for me just resolve themselves. And I'm very, very thankful that everybody could make it. Definitely. You're gone, Alan.
Thank you. I don't want to be too gone, but I thought the conversation went very deep and addressed some really hardcore spiritual topics that, it's all spiritual, it's all beautiful. Well, there are levels and levels that we need to discern along any pathway. And just because something may look sparkling, and bright, you have to go deeper into it and feel into it. So it reminded me, connect with the feelings. Don't, the grays were a great example of what not to do in a sense, because we're here for passion.
But how could we know? It's funny, there is such a wonderful story as well. How can we know that was, without their example, that's not the route to go? It's kind of like you got to go that way in order to know, to have one preference or another. It looked like,
right. You have to touch the stove and know it's hot, I guess. So
Yeah. Sometimes you're lucky enough to have somebody else touch the stove and let you know.
Exactly. Yes. That's it. So we are in a vast multiverse of verses of universes, so everything seems to be colliding in this point, like this sort of diagram behind me. It's like, boom, right? Coming through to us, all these levels coming into us. And which path do we take home? Ram Dass would say, we're just all walking each other home. So
I love that. Yeah.
So thank you for being on this journey with me and Justin and Geraldine and Tyler and Sarah.
Thank you.
And everyone watching online. We're going to do this every 2 weeks with a different group of channels, Justin.
Right. I think the next time we're aiming towards music, right? I think that our idea was maybe to channeling music.
And we'll have these people back on. I'd love to at some point, in this rotating series. And great. Thank you all for the time. I know it's time out of your day, but hey, what else are you going to do? This is our work. This is the work right here, right?
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank
Tyler,
you.
great to see you. And Geraldine, I'll see you.
Thank
And
you.
Sarah, bye. And
Thanks for all your work,
so much.
guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
So much,
We'll be in
Justin.
touch.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.